And this came about from an article I read where they were giving advice to the new Democratic ticket just yesterday in the New York Times, saying they have to understand the value of dignity at work and why this country is polarized, where people are just struggling to get ahead. It may not just be the price of eggs and milk, but it's because they're just not, it's inflation, but it's more than that. Their self-worth is not being recognized either personally or even at work. So a CHRO who understands that they need to listen and lead with empathy and recognize and reward and create a path and a career journey path. And there's very cool software, by the way, the tech stack that's out there that Burson talks about, that I talk about career journeys, Teri, is unbelievably powerful and interesting.
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, the CEO and managing partner at Sapient Insights Group. And I'm back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. This is the show where we like to break down the big and most relevant HR issues of the day. We help you make sense of what they mean for you, and we talk about what you might do about them. Joining me today is Marc Miller. Marc is the founder and president of his own HR tech consulting firm. He's an adjunct professor at NYU Manhattan College and a thought leader on HR and HR tech and all sorts of other things, but he's got a very interesting background. Welcome, Marc. I'm so glad to finally have you on the show. We've been planning this for a while.
Yes, indeed, Teri. It's my pleasure, and it's delightful to see you, even over Zoom. So it's always exciting to meet old friends in the industry, and I'm happy to be here and to participate in any way, shape, or form that this ends up being, which is great.
Well, I'm excited to get going because we almost did all the exciting stuff in the warm up. So I want to get to the good stuff.
Okay.
And I know that you've been doing HR and HR tech for a while. So You've seen a lot in your day. I think I read in your book that you're the longest continuing sole proprietorship in HR tech history.
Correct. I think so. It hasn't been proven by anybody who said, Marc, you're wrong. But I started in the industry in 73 when I joined a firm called Information Science. That was the founding vendor of the whole concept of HR technology. They had a skills database, and they then client, and this led to the founding of what was known as SP, Teri. That was the founding organization that led to IREM, because the Human Resource Systems Professionals was the name of the society that transitioned to IREM when the Canadian IREM and the American IREM merged to create HRSP many years ago. But I was one of the founding members of the New York chapter of HRSP. And that was in 1980, 1981, believe it or not. And I started my life as a chemist. And it's interesting, as a chemist, I was a pair of hands for a PhD. I wasn't excited to do that. I answered an ad for something called personnel analyst. And it turned out to be information science in New Jersey, actually in Rockland County, near New York here. And the guy who hired me was also a chemist from Dow Chemical. So he said, if I could do this work, you could do this work because you've got a chemistry background, so you're hired. And basically, we worked. There was a mainframe in the basement. I had key punch cards. It's going back. I'm dating myself. Yeah, I'm an aging. And you could tell from my email, it's an AOL email, which is everything in my life. I don't know how people change email so easily. But anyway, I
know, right?
So I ended up working with them, and they had this skills database. And then they had one key client, and the client said, well, if you're tracking employee skills for us, why don't you add job title? Why not salary? Why not where they work? And they ended up building the first HR system database. And then they built a package around it called the HRIS-1. And they started selling a mainframe-driven version of a system tracking employee data. That was the first thing. It was really interesting. And then I started my consultancy after I left them and went to Boeing Computer Services. And then I said, well, you know what, I want to do this on my own. And in 1983, so it's getting up there, with an interruption for 3 years at PricewaterhouseCoopers and what was then Towers Perrin, I started Marc Miller Associates. And what did I do? I made the decision then not to be anything bigger than myself, not to worry about people and their salaries and making sure I provide them enough work to deal with their families, etc. I stayed a sole proprietorship, and I made the decision not to be aligned with any vendor, even back then, with all the people that were bottom feeding off PeopleSoft and all the other vendors that started. And I said, no, I want to stay independent because I'm doing a lot of needs analysis, vendor evaluation, and selection. I can't have anybody say, oh, Marc, you selected PeopleSoft because you want to do their implementation work. No, I didn't want to do their implementation work. So that led to me continuing to keep my fingers on the pulse of what's happening in HR technology for almost 40 years, over 40 years. Which is fascinating. And there were a few people around at the time, but they've since gone on or passed away, actually. And I'm still the only sole proprietor, independent consultant in HR tech. And what worked out for me well, Teri, was the transitioning to adjunct teaching and to be an adjunct professor. It started with NYU, the Tandem School of Engineering, which started initially at Polytech, and then it went to NYU. They merged. And also at Manhattan College. And I have two diverse different groups of students every semester. And I'm teaching HR systems and analytics and also talent management. So, and doing the book.
So I also know you wrote a book, which you so kindly sent me a copy of. And what I'm calling is currently part of a trilogy, unless you write another one, right? And I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk about you know, HR tech, as well as the life, death, and resurrection of your book's protagonist, Harriet Rose. So
Harriet Rose Job, yes.
Does that sound like a good plan for this conversation?
I love it. Yes, I'll always talk about the death and resurrection of Harriet Rose Job. And it was interesting to me. I wrote The Death of HR 2013, and it was basically a cautionary tale. And I was able to act it out in some of the keynotes that you might have seen me do or see on my website, where I came across the body and found her dead. And I resurrected her then, back even before COVID happened. And we talked about what made her be a target, the fact that this woman was of a certain age, that she was just doing her HR job. And part of my talk then was she was walking to work and just being focused on herself, and she ended up being an obstacle for companies that in 2018, 2019, everything was booming and they wanted a nimble workforce and smart, curious people. And she had the attributes of having none of that. So she was targeted. She was deemed an obstacle. And in the Death of HR book, she had the fatal flaws. I called the fatal 5 eyes. She was irrelevant. She was indifferent. She was indecisive. She was incompetent. She was inflexible. She had no new skills. So when I talked about, well, how do you get from that to being alive? And that was the death of, started then. And we resurrected her back then. But what happened was, a couple of years later, the people at NYU said, Marc, we want you to teach talent management and we want you to talk about the role of HR and HR technology. And they said, use this syllabus. Well, the syllabus was written before COVID. And I said, I can't teach from this. I have to create a whole new syllabus. And then I, of course, knew that I had to rebuild the life of Harriet Rose Job, who was always in my mind. And I said, I have to resurrect her. So how do I do that? Well, I had to make her immortal. How did she become immortal? Well, the thing that happened was COVID entered the workforce. And we know that HR was at the center of everything involved with the workforce. So the kernel of the book was being asked to write a new syllabus and saying, well, I can't write a new syllabus without mentioning COVID and obviously HR's role, even at NYU. NYU had me teaching on a remote basis and a hybrid basis. I had students from China and Pakistan and Iran and India on a wall. I called it the Great Wall, while I was in the class or I was at home, and we were all masked. And but yet they had all these new technologies that I had to have a COVID test every week. I had to show my feelings on an app with a smiley emoji, how I felt, all of that. I had to pass through the facilities technology to get into the classroom, all of these things. And HR had to distribute all of this. And I realized HR was in the center of everything, which led to the resurrection, the death, and then the death and resurrection of Miss Harriet Rose Job, where it was triggered by COVID, basically, and how HR was critical in what they had to deliver, and to this day still have to deliver. And where people realize, oh my God, we did away with Harriet because she was a do-nothing, but the real good Harriet is in the center and owns all the data of our workforce. And we have to have a workforce in order to, A, survive COVID, and two, prosper and thrive as we get out of COVID. Now, believe it or not, it's been 4.5 years since.
It is hard to believe. Yeah. And from an HR perspective, I think it was the biggest change management project in history, right? I mean, just trying to mobilize all the things that landed in HR's sphere.
Absolutely.
During that time was unreal, right?
So when I structured the book, I was very lucky with the book to have the whole thread of the concept of her mindset. And even today, as we just started talking, there's another mindset which I would probably want to add, that of dignity, but let me get to that in a minute. But Harriet, in order to deliver what was necessary for the organization, she had to learn to collaborate. So the old Harriet was independent and didn't care, was irrelevant, indifferent to others, wasn't a good communicator. But the new Harriet had to learn to collaborate with all the people and the characters in the book, which I started in The Death of HR. That's that second book. The first book was called Heroic HR, which I wrote in 2011 or so. But it's a similar theme. And the cool thing is I was able to act this out in keynotes and speaking and coming across the crime scene and having my friends be the body of Harriet Rose Job, lying with a mouse cord wrapped around her neck. It was a lot of fun. And that's what I'm still trying to do. And in fact, I'll be speaking at the SHRM conference in Atlantic City at the end of September on the Immortal HR. And I have a good couple of speeches related to Immortal HR, with Connie Vid entering with the music of Jaws and all of that. What happened? How could she be alive? She's alive. She's alive. What happened? Well, Connie Vid came, and the Jaws music came with that. And all these people that she learned to collaborate with were critical in helping to deliver, one, what was necessary to get over the initial impact of COVID with these apps and worrying about employee well-being, and then two, to collaborate and learn to use the technology that's in our hand. This is even before artificial intelligence, but as I was writing, Arturo Intelligente, meaning artificial intelligence, and Mr. Chet GPT became major collaborators and characters, helping her become critical and needed, and thus on the path to mortality, which is what the book is all about. And there were so many people that used to want to do away with her, and did so in that first book, that ended up being her biggest advocates and collaborators, because she needed to know certain new things, and leveraging the technology and learning to collaborate and learning about metrics and data visualization and storytelling. And all of that is very critical to us in the world of HR. And this whole thing with AI is indeed, it's probably another whole major titanic shift to everything. And the influencers that influenced me in helping me to write this book were people like Sapient, of course, yourself and Stacey Harris, and Josh Burson and Dave Ulrich with his human capability, and AIHR, the Academy for Innovation and Human Resources. These were all friends of mine in the industry who pitched in and helped me utilize their latest research to build the story of what COVID did and how do we get out of it, which is what's in the book, which thank you for the kind words. And it's selling interestingly well, and it's being translated into a couple of languages potentially. I offer it as part of my syllabus at both Manhattan College and NYU. So I assign my students chapters, but they have the opportunity to see it on the learning system, but also many of them say, oh, we want the book, we want you to sign it, and they order it, and it's fun to deliver that to them as well.
Yeah.
Many SHRM chapters have had me speak recently. They use the book as a raffle and they raffle it off, and that's fine. And I'm just happy to do that. I'm happy to talk about the role of HR and HR technology at a minute's notice as we're seeing. And it's critical. I mean, I'm having lunch with the CHRO of all of NYU, who started recently, less than a year ago. And her first 6 months, she's doing a listening tour. And she's not ready to do anything yet until she understands why at NYU, there's 20 different schools. There's the Stern School of Business. There's the Tandon School of Engineering, where I happen to teach. I'm kind of an outlier. There's all the School of Film and Tisch and all that. They don't communicate with each other. And then there's the School of Professional Studies that has a very big analytics department. They don't communicate with each other.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's just scary that they don't. And one of the keys to Harriet Rose's success, meaning the function of HR, period. I chose Harriet Rose Job because it sounded good. It was a middle-aged woman. It was the person you always think of in the personnel department. And, over my years, I've used the word personnel disparagingly. And in fact, my very first piece of humor was using Clint Eastwood in the movie The Enforcer, where he shoots up a liquor store and gets transferred to, and gets called into his commissioner's office after shooting it up and saving the hostage in San Francisco. And I used a film clip of it. And in the film, he gets called up to the police commissioner's office and saying, Harry, we've had it with your shoot 'em up. You cost this department $7,250. How could that be? Well, the plate glass window, all the stuff you did, plus we'll probably be sued by the hostages. He said, well, what about the hood? Well, you told me to get rid of the hoods in San Francisco, but not that way. He said, Harry, if you do this one more time, we've had it with you. He said, well, okay. He says, you're being transferred. Where? To personnel. Personnel. Harry says the following: personnel, that's for assholes.
Oh.
And the guy stands up behind his desk smoking a cigar. 1972 movie, The Enforcer, one of the Dirty Harry movies. I was in personnel for 10 years. And Harry just goes like that. Yep, and walks out. Now, I've kept that word in the speeches that I've given since then. And I've given it to thousands of people. And I say, this is where we've come from. The vision of what, quote, personnel was. And I basically tell my students and anybody who listen, don't ever work for a company that has a, quote, personnel department.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to be human resources or chief people officer or chief employee experience officer. All these great new C-level terms are critical. And I tell my students, if you're interested in HR, make sure that they're not calling it personnel.
Yeah.
And that's where we were back then.
Yeah. I think we can sometimes take ourselves too seriously in HR. So I love the spin on the book and the way that you've sort of turned it into this almost theater. Yeah, it raises a question that I have about so in the most recent book, the third book, Immortal HR, you highlighted early in the book a whole bunch of articles from over the last 20 years about how everybody hates HR, everybody's fed up with HR. I don't know if you saw that New York Times artical within the last week or so about how hated we are as HR. And I thought people felt pretty good about their companies and generally HR during COVID, at least those that still had a job, right? And, they thought the comms were good and the company was paying attention to them. But I guess, has that worn off, or is this just another HR hit piece?
Great question. I happen to have the article in front of me. It's called So Human Resources is Making You Miserable. And
exactly.
I met with a gentleman that knows one of the women that was profiled as a CHRO. But yes, again, HR has got to be the focal point of collaboration. And with AI, HR shouldn't make anybody miserable. HR should be focusing on strategy and being a strategic business partner. And if anybody is being made miserable by HR, one, it's not the fault of the vendor today. I think the better vendors, the top tier vendors, and in listening to your research at Sapient Insights and Burson's work and AIHR's work, there's a bunch of them. There's 4 or 5 that I immediately consider when anybody's talking to me about needs analysis and vendor evaluation. The workflow is supported very strongly by AI. There should be less people doing administrivia and more people doing strategic value-added business partnership. The HR person or anybody in HR should at a minimum know the mission vision of the company they're working for. In both of my books, and I updated it in the Immortal HR book, I have a clout survey. And that was done with some tongue in cheek, but it's basically asking the readers and anybody who will listen to me to say, how well do you know your organization and what's their mission? And can you name the competitor, the same competitor that your president would name if you're in any HR? And they should understand it. And they should understand the concept of key performance indices, metrics, analytics, predictive analytics, and even prescriptive analytics. And the strength of AI, as you well know with Sapient's work, is that it's able to build these indices to help HR be at the center as a collaborator with the C-level of executives and being a strategic, not just strategic partner, but a strategic business partner, understanding the business. And in my books and talks, I talk about you need to know the big picture. You need to know what your industry is doing. You need to know what technology you have and if it's working well. You need to know what the users think of it. You need to, quote, listen, like the new CHRO is doing at NYU for 6 months now, finding out what's driving the end user and what it looks like. And then just as we talked a minute before this began, something new has arisen in my mind, the dignity of work. I think the secret ingredient for any high level, the most senior person, let's not call it Harriet Rose Job, let's not even call it the CHRO, just the most senior person in any size company has to understand what dignity is all about and what the workforce is feeling. And this came about from an article I read where they were giving advice to the new Democratic ticket just yesterday in the New York Times, saying they have to understand the value of dignity at work and why this country is polarized, where people are just struggling to get ahead. It may not just be the price of eggs and milk, but it's because they're just not, it's inflation, but it's more than that. Their self-worth is not being recognized either personally or even at work. So a CHRO who understands that they need to listen and lead with empathy and recognize and reward and create a path and a career journey path. And there's very cool software, by the way, the tech stack that's out there that Burson talks about, that I talk about career journeys, Teri, is unbelievably powerful and interesting. Yeah. There's software out there, I won't name them, there's just a few, that you could say, I'm the cafeteria cook right now, but you know what? I want to be the CHRO. I've got software now that I could put in where I am today, where I want to be by title, and the software will actually create a roadmap. It might take 20 years, and it will have 50 steps, with each step indicating what you need to do as an individual in terms of training and leadership and skills and what you need to attain. But they will show you a roadmap that for 20 years it might take, you could end up being the CHRO when you're the cafeteria cook.
It could happen. And I think, one of the things that I like to say is that, what's the first thing you need to know in your new job?
Right.
It's not how to do your job.
No.
It's how does the business make its money, number one. And number two, then how does the work that I do impact how the business makes its money?
Exactly right.
And that's your trajectory. I mean, if you know that, you can go anywhere.
The key word is value. How do I add strategic oriented value and manage that so that my CEO doesn't question me about what I'm doing? In other words, feels I, as the most senior HR person, as an equal business partner, maybe at the C level or anywhere, adding value to the organizations. And that value is driven by the workforce and their feeling about their work and their ability to stay in that company, because employee retention or talent management is critical. So these things are interwoven every day in terms of talent acquisition, talent development and training, and talent retention. It's all based on, hey, how's your workforce? I would say Ultimate Software, before they became UKG, was the first vendor that I noticed, maybe 10 years now, was able to create the strategic 9-box model, which is performance versus potential, low, medium, high. So you could just picture it, either axis, doesn't matter. And they were actually able to track flight risk for key people. So they actually would, and I have screenshots of this, they would generate from their software using, what's the word? Unstructured text that people use in emails, and track whether you're happy or dissatisfied, and say, oh, Teri Zipper, she seems to be using negative adjectives in her memos because the company's watching you every day.
Or curse words.
Right. Exactly. And maybe she's an unhappy person, but yet we've got her in the upper right-hand corner being high potential, high performance. She's considered, quote, a key employee. And yet we're seeing some, there's a word I'm missing, but her unstructured language, which we have access to, is indicating she's unhappy.
She's a flight risk.
Yeah, it's a flight risk, and they could make some they could intercede on that and say, okay, we understand you're unhappy, or we think you are. What's going on, and try to prevent you from leaving. And that is sentiment analysis. That's what the word is. They're able to use algorithms back then, 5-10 years ago. UKG was one of the first. Ultimate was actually before UKG, to create sentiment analysis. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of what AI is doing now in HR, and the predictive and prescriptive analytics. I love discussing that. It's like going to a doctor and get a prescription. But prescriptive analytics says, hey, you got a good trend. What do you do now to keep your trend good? Because the trend is coming up in the predictive side, but how do you keep it going good? Or we've got a bad prediction. How do we turn it around? And what's the prescription for turning it around to make it a good prediction? Yeah. So all those analytics, the flight risk, the length of service, when people leave, the plateauing, their sentiment, their pulse surveys, everything's on the desk of HR. Yeah. Everything that we do, the listening, the empathy, the ESG, the DEI, all of this stuff that's out there, LGBT plus, everything. And it's hitting politics as well, because there was an article in the Times that brought me to this, was giving advice to say, understand dignity. Do you feel that you're being recognized as an individual person and at work? And the CHRO is the leader in making sure that the company's actions and mindsets treat the workforce, the Harriet Rose Jobs of this world, all the way up, with dignity and respect, so that they see it and they feel it. And if that's the case, they see a career path. There's a path, what I called in the book, the path to immortality, and they'll stay and they'll work their asses off for the company. And they'll know that the company will succeed, because hopefully the company has profit sharing and other things that make them say, this is family. This is my second family, you know? Yeah. And I think moving from the original data management to information craftsmanship, as I called it in both books, taking the data from a database it used to be an integrated database with HR, payroll, benefits, and applicant tracking and onboarding and all that stuff, which you and I know, and I teach through my courses. It could be now other databases and other third-party formulas and dashboards, and showing visualization of trends and tiles and everything on a smartphone. Forget about the desktop, everything in the hand of the worker. That's all good stuff, and it's got to help. Yeah,
yeah. We've talked a lot about strategic HR, and I know you talked about this as well in your book. I think, one of the key components of that is, how do we, as HR, take all that information and turn it into the stories that senior leadership can understand and actually relate to? Like, in order for something big to happen, there typically needs to be some sort of visceral reaction. You can't just say, well, our turnover's way up.
Yeah,
It's a problem,
yeah.
right? Well, what's the problem, right? Well, we can't keep engineers in our primary, department that's delivering the goods and service. Like we've got to have engineers. So, they've got to turn these things into stories. And I loved your analogy in the book, like everything, everywhere, all at once,
Right.
From the movie. I mean, this feels like HR every day, right? And now with how do we take AI and help us?
I think the most effective use of AI and also the most effective, most senior leader within the functions of HR, which encompasses HR, payroll, benefits. I'm leaving out finance, but everything from womb to tomb has to know how to sell value add and prove value. And depending on who their leadership is and how much numerically oriented they are, that could be a problem. But at the same time, if you're working for a leader of a company that has a sense that the company's on a good path and manages with their concept of dignity and empathy and leadership qualities, that's a good thing. But if you're dealing with a numbers person who only looks at a number and therefore cuts or increases your budget based on last year's sales, that might be a problem for a forward-thinking CHRO person. They might say, "Oh, no, I need a company that's more visceral, that understands the trends and the mission vision and allows this company to be part of a community, not just the community in the industry we're in, but in the community in which we have factories, in which we depend on people to come to work and do their work." So it's telling the story. Storytelling, I think, and data visualization is a critical skill. And I would say to my friends in leadership, you don't have to do it yourself. Hire these kids coming out of schools now, the engineering schools or the data scientists and the people that are working with chatbots and all of these things with artificial intelligence, the prompt engineers. Teri, is crazy. Prompt engineers is a new job title, and they're getting $200,000 for it in order to word something that will generate something coming out of the artificial intelligence engines in Google, Bard, or whatever is out there. And you saw in my book, I asked, when I was writing the book, I did a quick one. I said, give me the job description of the first HR managers on the moon. And what do they have to deal with? And within minutes, they gave it to me, and I put it in the book. And within minutes, I said, well, what about the positives and negatives of AI? Let's write the 10 commandments of the use of AI. And I put that in the book, because within seconds, I got thou shalt not know that AI is not human, and consider that as well. But but the power is since then doubled probably or tripled. And I think a good use of HR technology is, one, know its possibilities, but also understand its impact on the end users, and understand that you might not need to use all the possibilities that are on the table, because you're just doing too much too quickly all at once, to the mindset of a worker who's worried about their next paycheck and worried if they'll have a job next year and worried about AI taking their jobs. And that's another aspect of it. So you can't be 100% in on AI and not worry about, well, what's the impact on the workforce? Are they going to lose their jobs? And if that's what they're feeling, that's not a good thing. So what are we doing to allay that concern and let them know that they'll be in a newer position, learning new skills, using more value-adding KPIs and upskilling, and have a different career path? I think that's the bottom line.
Yeah. I think human resources, to use the term, has gotten more human over time. And I think AI, to me, is the catalyst to, put the human back in human resources. It gives us the opportunity to just, have those moments with people, to be able to help them through that journey, right?
Yeah.
Versus just focusing on compliance and, all the stuff that we hate to do in HR.
Right. I think the 9-box model, which whoever did it hundreds of years ago, it's been around, had a good idea. And I also talk about, let's not forget the people who have very high performance, but are on the bottom level and not high potential. But these are the sole contributors. These are the people that are in the back office doing the coding or working on building a new chat bot or a new algorithm. But maybe they don't want to be a leader. You can't forget about them because they're not in the upper right of a 9-box model. And I think a good leader of any company and good collaboration with everybody in the leadership levels has to recognize we've got all kinds of people. There are people that will say, okay, fine. You know what? I'm going to do my best. I'm going to bust my ass. I'm going to go 9 to 5, and then I'm going to go home and work on my hobbies and play with my kids and my dogs and have good familial relations with my outside of work life. But yet they're still good workers. So you can't just focus everything on the top tier. You've got to just say, we've got a workforce. Is our workforce on the same page? And are we treating everyone with dignity? And that, I think, is a key new word that I want to focus on in the future. And yeah, I'm happy about the visibility that Harriet Rose Job and her path to immortality and the speech and the crime scene that I uncovered and her resurrection. And actually, COVID made the difference. And HR was at the center of it because people began to realize when COVID first hit March of 2020 and then a few months afterwards, people were saying, holy cow, what do we do? Where's the data? How do we handle this? What do we mandate? What's the legality of asking our employees to be vaccinated? What do we do about masking? How do we deal with people sitting in an elevator? What do we do about remote work? What's this thing called Zoom? How do we deal with the people that are older like me that don't know how to press the right button to show their picture or to mute themselves? All of this, how do we train people? I had to go through it as a professor at NYU, and my students had to go through it when they were sitting in a hotel in China because they were quarantined or anywhere. And we got to remember that HR was in the center of that. And then it finally progressed. Well, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? How are we treating you well? Are you happy? Are you satisfied? You know, it even ties into cybersecurity, Teri. When I used to talk about HR's role in cybersecurity, one of the things we talked about is how do you know when a person's a disgruntled employee? And maybe a disgruntled employee is open to blackmail. And maybe it's a simple kind of blackmail. We say, oh, Miller, how would you like $10,000? Here's the USB key. Could you stick it in and get the social security numbers for your workforce for $10,000? And you know what? People will do it and did do it, especially during tax season. And now with artificial intelligence, they could imitate the voice of this chief financial officer. You know, so
yeah.
It's crazy, Teri.
Yeah, it is.
But everybody came to HR saying, well, what's the law? How do we deal with this? Do we mandate? How do we force people to return to work? It's still being a fight, even today.
I think that's a really good point. You know, I was talking to a CHRO not too long ago and asking her about, there's still this debate about return to work. And, you know, she said to me, look, this is not an HR issue. This is an organization. This is at the most senior levels. Like I'm not deciding this, and I'm not the driver of it. It has to be driven by from the CEO on down. If that's going to happen, if we're going to make that work, whatever the decision is, whether we work from home, work remote, hybrid, come to the office.
I think hybrid is the answer. And I think you should give employees the choice. And I think there's built-in bias, though, that people are saying, well, if I'm not in front of my boss, he's going to forget about me and maybe I won't get promoted. So you got that thought point going through people's minds. I think there's going to end up being, listen, I live in the New York area. I go into Manhattan. It seemed very crowded when I was in Manhattan and yet 41% of the real estate of the office buildings are not occupied the way they were before COVID. So the question is, well, what's going on? It's funny, on the traffic reports, they would say, well, it's a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Traffic is bad. If it was a Monday and Friday, traffic is less bad driving into Manhattan or something like that. So I think we're going to end up being 2 to 3, 4 days. I would say 3 days of work is probably normal. And there are a lot of people that just love going into work and schmoozing with their friends and having that socialness of being a part of a workforce. It does get lost when you're not there a few days a week, or at least quarterly meetings. And I think that's where it's going to end up. And I think it's for, the flexibility I have to be able to decide when to go on Zoom or not to go on Zoom and when to work and all that. It is. I mean,
Yeah. I think it's really hard for the younger workforce. And
Yeah,
just think of all the just little things that you learned about work being in the office.
yeah,
You can't necessarily learn those things from Zoom. I mean,
correct.
you figure them out, but it might take a lot longer. If you're sitting down, across the way from somebody, you learn the simplest things, right? It doesn't even have to be specific to your job. It's just sort of general business knowledge that you miss out on working fully remotely.
Totally. I think it's in your head. If you're working for a company that you like working
Yeah.
for and have been there a number of years and they're treating you right, in your brain's never going to not think of that company, even if you're at home on a weekend or you're on vacation. I was in Venice 2 weeks ago, and there was a statue of four what they called Caesars and emperors on the corner of the Basilica in Venice. And they were, I don't bother sharing my screen, but you could see these four people, and they were hugging each other, two and two. And when I looked up, they're called the four four tetrarchs. And it's a famous statue dating back to 313, the year 313. And it was built then, and it was put into the Basilica in St. Mark's Square in Venice. And they were hugging each other, and yet they had their swords at the ready. And I looked at that, and I'm with people, and I said, they're collaborating, they're hugging each other. And I tied it right back to even today's discussion, thinking about bringing it up, saying, you always got to be ready, and you got to be willing to collaborate with enemies. And these four people depicted, two were Caesars, one was called Augustus, and the two senior ones were called Augustuses, like Augustus Maximus, and the two junior ones were called Caesars. And that's what they were probably called when this was originally sculptured out of very interesting metal. And yet they had their hands around each other's shoulders, and yet another hand, kind of this dripping down towards the hilt of their sword. So they were ready for enemies, and they were the eastern and the western sections of the Roman emperorship then. And I'm saying, well, they're learning to collaborate, and that's what we all have to do, and we have to recognize the positives and negatives of that, but I can't see any negatives of collaboration. It certainly helped Harriet Rose Job become immortal and needed, because she delivered with collaboration all the things that we talked about and mentioned in my book, what needed to get through COVID, and now moving forward with artificial intelligence. I said in my last page, beware Arturo Intelligente, because it's not smooth sailing ahead. Who knows what AI will end up doing, not just to HR, but to other functions within the world of HR. And Mr. ChatGPT and Arturo Intelligente and Sue Systems and some of these other characters, we have to deal with them. And HR still has to understand. HR can never be an island, period. So it's a lot of fun, and I thank you for your kind comments, allowing me to talk about the book. And it's exciting to me, and I'm excited to talk about it and to show me finding the body when she was originally done away with by the same people that now need her.
Your graphics are great.
Thank you.
I really I loved that.
But you know what's interesting? The book had such more gravitas than I expected, because my publisher said, you need a proofreader. So she introduced me to a bunch, and I interviewed them. It turned out this woman, her name was Connie, which is funny because I'm dealing with Connie Vid. Her name was in real life Connie, and she was a developmental editor. She put my foot to the fire. Every picture, every cartoon, every quote had to be cleared. Even pictures of Bill Gates and other people, I had to get permissions, or at least go to a free website and I had to buy cartoons, and I had to make sure the quotes, even dealing with your folks at Sapient, they were great. When I wanted to use your research, I had to make sure that I used it properly and got permissions from you and Stacy to make sure everything had to be in order. And the developmental editor had to, besides doing all the proofreading, had to make sure I got permissions. It was quite an interesting, eye-opening thing. Totally.
Yeah. Will you write a sequel?
I don't know. Maybe not. There's so much being written about artificial intelligence every day.
Yeah.
You get it. You get the same LinkedIn feeds I get. You could see so much is being written. Richard Grosnow, David Green, Josh, you and Stacy, and your team at Sapient, AI HR. Those are the key ones I look at. Dave Ulrich, of course, human capability. It's just another name for the things you and I are talking about today.
Right.
So,
Right.
but they put it into a process and they sell it, which is fine. All I want to do is talk about it and preach about it and have fun doing it. And that's my goal as an aging boomer.
Yeah.
And, at this point, nobody's going to hire me as a full-time person. I don't want it. And at this point, writing is fun. Speaking to students is fun. Speaking to chapters at SHRM or other entities or user groups is fine. I have a message that's important to HR, and I'm glad to do it. And I'm glad to have friends in the industry like you.
Well, it's a great book. I loved it. I hope people will read it. Thank you so much for joining the conversation today. Are you going to be at HR Tech? Stacy's going to be there signing books.
I know it keeps conflicting with my teaching. And I've talked to my chairman about it, and I just can't rearrange my schedule and miss a couple of classes and teach Zoom wise from there. And I haven't gone in a while, but it's difficult. But they could go to immortalhr.com and take a look at the fun stuff and sneak previews of the chapter. If they use the promo code HR Folks, they'll get 10% off. I'll get the book here. I'll sign it to them and mail it to them directly.
Awesome.
Promo code HR Folks. I didn't build one just for Sapient or HR Huddle. I probably could create one for HR Huddle.
We can put one in the caption when we send it out.
I'm delighted I'm honored that you've asked me to speak with you today. I've seen some of your others and they're fabulous, and I'm glad to be part of your list of people that you spend time with, and I hope to see you in person, and we'll keep in touch, right?
Sounds good. Yeah, we certainly will. Thank you again, Marc, for joining today. And thanks to our producers, Brand Method Media Group, our marketing team, who's going to get this out there to you. And thank you for tuning in. This is all the time we have for this week's episode of HR We Have a Problem. If you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe to it on your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you'd leave us a review. We'd love to know what you want to hear about, what kinds of things you want us to talk about. And we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.